the low, grinding rumble of wooden wheels dragging across dry Persian earth. The greatest empire the world had ever seen, 2 centuries in the making, stretching from Egypt to India, is dying. Not on a battlefield, not under the blade of any Macedonian soldier. It is dying inside a wooden ox cart, jolting through the dust of a road heading east, away from everything the King of Kings once owned. Inside that cart is Darius III, the last true Achaemenid, bound, chained, bleeding. His own generals have locked him away like a caged animal, the man who once commanded one of the largest royal armies of the ancient age, who sat on the jewelled throne of Cyrus the Great, who carried the divine title King of Kings, Lord of all nations, is now a prisoner, not of Alexander, not of the Macedonians, of his own people, his own generals, his own blood. He will never see his throne again. Because here is the brutal truth that history rarely speaks loudly enough. Alexander the Great did not end the Persian Empire. The empire ended itself. It was strangled from the inside by cold ambition, political calculation, and the betrayal of one man sworn by blood and duty to protect his king. That man's name was Bessus, satrap of Bactria, and what he did in the summer of 330 BC is one of the darkest acts of treachery in the entire ancient world. This is not the story of a conquest. This is a political thriller set 2,300 years ago. This is the story of a king abandoned, a general turned traitor, and an empire that collapsed not with a roar, but with the quiet click of golden chains. Stay right here, because what you are about to hear will change the way you see the fall of Persia forever. If you're new to this channel, hit that subscribe button right now and ring that bell, because this is exactly the kind of history we cover here. The raw, unfiltered, brutal truth behind the wars and power struggles that shaped our world. And if you already know us, drop a like before we go any further. It genuinely helps more people find this story. Now, let us go back to 330 BC to feel the full weight of what happened inside the ox cart on a dusty road in Bactria. You first need to understand what Darius III was standing on when he fell, and exactly how far down he had to go. The Achaemenid Persian Empire was not just a kingdom, it was the organising force of the ancient world. Founded by Cyrus the Great in 550 BC, it had grown for 2 centuries into something no civilization had ever built before. A superstate stretching from the Aegean coast of modern Turkey in the west, to the frontiers of India in the east, and from the steppes of Central Asia in the north, all the way down to the deserts of Egypt in the south. At its height, historians estimate it held roughly 44% of the entire world population within its borders. Dozens of languages, hundreds of gods, thousands of miles of royal road connecting it all together, and at the absolute top of this world stood one man, the King of Kings, a title that was not merely political, it was cosmic. The Persian Great King was the chosen representative of Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity on earth. His word was law across a continent. When he issued a command, satraps, governors of vast provinces, obeyed without question. When he moved, nations knelt. The throne itself was not just power, it was the divine order made flesh. That was the throne Darius III inherited in 336 BC. The very same year, a 20-year-old Macedonian prince named Alexander watched his father, King Philip II, get stabbed to death at a wedding celebration in the city of Aegae. Darius had not been born to rule. He was not from the direct royal line. His birth name was Artashata, a nobleman, a court official, placed onto the throne by the powerful court eunuch Bagoas, who had already poisoned 2 previous kings, Artaxerxes III and his own son Arses. Darius was supposed to be controllable, a manageable face on an empire that men like Bagoas intended to run from the shadows. Instead, when Darius realized what Bagoas was, he had the eunuch drink his own poison. The puppet had cut his own strings. He was, by all ancient accounts, a man of genuine personal courage. Tall, physically imposing, the ancient sources specifically noted his commanding appearance. He was not a weak man. He was not a fool. He simply had the catastrophic misfortune of inheriting a crumbling bureaucracy at the exact moment the most dangerous military mind in human history decided to come knocking. In 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia with an army of roughly 37,000 men. a force that looked almost insultingly small against the Persian machine. Within 2 years, he had crushed Persian forces at the Granicus River in northwestern Turkey. Then came the Battle of Issus in November 333 BC, where Darius himself commanded the Persian army and, when Alexander's cavalry punched through the lines and drove straight at the royal command position, Darius turned his chariot and fled, leaving behind his mother Sisygambis, his wife Statera, and his daughters as prisoners of the Macedonians. That flight at Issus became a stain on Darius that his enemies, and eventually his own generals, would never forget. But Issus was only the opening wound. The killing blow came later. On October 1st, 331 BC, on a vast flat plain near a village called Gaugamela in what is today northern Iraq, Darius made his absolute last stand. He had chosen the ground deliberately, had the terrain levelled to maximise the impact of his scythed chariots and massive cavalry. He had assembled the largest force he could pull from across the empire, an army that ancient sources describe in almost unimaginable numbers, and which even conservative modern estimates agree was far larger than anything Alexander had faced before. It was not enough. Alexander's oblique assault, the disciplined thrust of his companion cavalry, and his own personal charge directly into the gap that opened in the Persian centre shattered the entire formation. Darius, for the second time, fled the battlefield. His subordinates fought on, and some fought brilliantly, but the centre had broken, and the king was gone. And as the fires burned low across the plain of Gaugamela that October night, as the Macedonians counted their dead and celebrated their impossible victory, something else was beginning. Something quieter, something far more dangerous to Darius than any Macedonian spear. Because riding east beside their fleeing king in the darkness and the dust were men who had just watched the most powerful empire on earth lose in a single afternoon. Men who had given everything for that empire, and who now had to decide what that loyalty was still worth. One of them was already calculating. His name was Bessus, and he had a plan. The night after Gaugamela was the darkest of Darius III's life. Not because of the dead, though there were tens of thousands of them, piled across a plain that had been so carefully levelled, so meticulously prepared to be his killing ground. And not because of the treasure and the war elephants and the royal equipment left behind in the chaos of the collapse. It was dark because of what Darius now understood, riding east in the night with dust coating his armour and the sound of his own army disintegrating behind him, that there was no coming back from this. Gaugamela was not Issus. At Issus, 2 years earlier, he had been surprised on narrow ground. He could blame the terrain. He could blame bad luck. He could rebuild his forces, choose better ground, and try again. He had done exactly that, but Gaugamela had been his perfect ground. He had chosen it himself. He had levelled it himself. He had assembled the greatest army he could pull from across 20 satrapies, cavalry from Bactria and Scythia, scythed chariots rebuilt specifically for this battle, Indian war elephants, and the royal guard infantry that Greek writers associated with the older tradition of the immortals. He had done everything right, and Alexander had still walked straight through the centre of his formation and driven him off the field in a single afternoon. That knowledge rode with him through the dark, heavier than any armour. He fled first to Arbela, the nearby supply base, where he grabbed what gold and provisions he could. Then east, always east toward Ecbatana, the ancient Median capital nestled high in the Zagros Mountains of what is today western Iran. Ecbatana was approximately 500 miles from the battlefield. 500 miles of road that Darius covered as fast as a broken army could move, always looking over his shoulder, always calculating how far behind him Alexander's cavalry might be. The royal road, that magnificent network of highways expanded and systematized under Darius the Great to bind an empire together, was now being used by the last Achaemenid to run from the man who was tearing that empire apart stone by stone. Every mile east was a mile further from his throne. Every mile east was a confession that the Western Empire, Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, Egypt, all of it, was already lost. When he finally reached Ecbatana, Darius tried to do what kings do. He tried to project authority. He sent out calls across the eastern satrapies for soldiers, supplies, and loyalty. And to his partial credit, some of it came. Bactrians, Sogdians, Scythians from the eastern frontier, contingents from the Indian borderlands, men who had not been at Gaugamela and who still, for the moment, recognised the title of King of Kings. He gathered a force around himself, somewhere between a full army and a desperate hope, and began organising it at Ecbatana. There was still a plan. There was still a vision. He would hold the eastern half of the empire, the part beyond the Zagros Mountains, beyond the great Iranian plateau deep into Central Asia, and he would make Alexander fight for every inch of it on ground that did not favour Macedonian phalanx tactics. It was not an insane strategy. The east was vast. The east was rugged. The east could swallow armies whole. Cyrus the Great himself had died fighting nomadic peoples on the eastern frontier. Maybe, the east could stop Alexander where the west had failed. But while Darius was planning at Ecbatana, Alexander was not standing still. He was never standing still. Within weeks of Gaugamela, the Macedonian king had marched his army into Babylon. The ancient city, one of the most important in the known world, sacred to the god Marduk, wealthy beyond calculation, opened its gates without a fight. The city's governor, Mazaeus, the same commander who had fought brilliantly on the Persian right wing at Gaugamela, surrendered. Then came Susa, the great administrative capital of the Achaemenid Empire, where the royal treasury held a fortune in gold and silver accumulated over 200 years of imperial taxation. It fell without resistance. Alexander reportedly found 40,000 talents of silver there alone, a number so vast it is almost meaningless to modern ears, but in ancient terms it was enough to fund a military campaign for decades. Every city that surrendered was a piece of the Persian Empire that Darius would never see again. Every treasure emptied was the economic lifeblood of his civilization flowing directly into Macedonian hands. And then came Persepolis. This was not just a city. Persepolis was the ceremonial heart of the Achaemenid world, the city of the great kings, where Darius I and Xerxes had built their audience halls, their treasury palaces, their towering gateways carved with the tribute bearers of 100 nations. It was the spiritual address of the Persian Empire, the place where the concept of the King of Kings was made physical in stone and gold. Alexander took it in early 330 BC, and he allowed his troops to sack it. The looting was catastrophic. Then, in an act whose exact motivation historians have debated for centuries, whether it was a calculated political statement, a drunken decision, or a deliberate act of revenge for Xerxes burning Athens in 480 BC, Alexander set fire to the great palace complex. The Persians who heard about it, and the news travelled fast along the royal road, understood that it was not simply the destruction of a building. It was Alexander standing in the sacred centre of their civilization and burning it to tell them that their world was over. Darius received this news at Ecbatana, and it broke something in him that battle had not broken. Because battles are survivable. You can rebuild an army. You cannot rebuild 2 centuries of symbolic authority. The burning of Persepolis was a message sent directly to every satrap, every noble, every soldier still riding under the Persian banner. The old world is finished. Choose your next king carefully. When Alexander left Persepolis and turned north toward Ecbatana, Darius knew that even this last refuge was about to be taken from him. He faced a brutal choice: stand at Ecbatana with his reduced forces and fight a battle he knew he would lose, or continue east toward Bactria and hope to find ground and time to rebuild. He chose to run, not out of pure cowardice. The ancient sources are clear that Darius was physically brave as an individual, but out of a cold, strategic calculation that dying in a losing stand at Ecbatana accomplished nothing. Bactria was different. Bactria was deep, hard terrain. And Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, commanded some of the finest cavalry forces in the eastern world. Running east meant running toward Bessus's strength, or so he believed. He led his reduced army out of Ecbatana and toward the Caspian Gates, a narrow, critical mountain pass cutting through the Elburz range south of the Caspian Sea, roughly corresponding to terrain east of modern Tehran. The Caspian Gates were his natural defensive choke point, a place where a pursuing army would be forced to slow, to funnel, to become vulnerable. He moved through them with speed, looking to create distance between himself and the Macedonian advance. But something was happening inside his army on that march that no king ever wants to see. The men were not following him the same way anymore. There were desertions, individual soldiers at first, then small groups, then whole units melting away in the night. Men who calculated that the losing side of a war was not where they wanted to be. Mercenaries who had been paid in Persian gold began asking quiet questions about whether Alexander was offering terms. Cavalry commanders who had pledged their loyalty to the King of Kings started having private conversations with each other that they stopped having when Darius walked by. The army was still moving east, but it was no longer a Persian army in spirit. It was becoming something else, a collection of armed men, held together less by loyalty than by the absence of a better option. One man in that march saw what was happening with perfect clarity. His name was Patron. He was a Greek mercenary commander, one of those professional soldiers who sold their skills to the highest bidder, and he had attached himself to Darius's service. Patron was not a Persian, had no political loyalties, no court ambitions, no rivalry to protect. He simply watched the faces of the men around the king and understood what he was seeing. He went to Darius privately and told him the truth that none of the Persian nobles would say out loud. He warned the king that there were men in the army who could not be trusted. He asked, pleaded, for permission to replace Darius's Persian royal bodyguard with his own Greek mercenaries, soldiers who had no stake in Persian court politics, no ambition to seize power, no incentive to betray a king, who paid well. A foreign guard for a foreign threat. Darius refused. He refused not because he was blind to the danger, there is every indication he sensed it, but because accepting a foreign bodyguard would have been a public admission that he could not trust his own people. And for a man whose entire political identity rested on the mystique of the King of Kings, that admission was simply impossible. He was the chosen of Ahura Mazda, the lord of all nations. To be seen hiding behind Greek mercenaries would have confirmed every whisper that was already circulating. So Patron went back to his men, and Darius rode on through the dust, heading toward Bactria, surrounded by men he could not trust, protected by a title that was losing its power with every mile. He just did not know yet that two of those men had already made their decision. There is a particular kind of conversation that happens in armies when the cause is failing. It does not happen loudly. It does not happen at council meetings, where words are recorded and faces are watched. It happens at the edges of campfires, in the quiet hour before dawn, between men who have served together long enough to know what the other is thinking without saying it. It happens when two officers look at each other across the body of a dying enterprise and realize, in the same moment, that they are thinking the exact same dangerous thought. That conversation began somewhere on the road between Ecbatana and the Caspian Gates, between a satrap and a court official, and it would end with the King of Kings in chains. The man who started that conversation, or at least the man who finished it and turned it into action, was Bessus. And to understand what Bessus did, you first have to understand who Bessus was. Because he was not simply a regional governor. He was not some ambitious nobody who had clawed his way into proximity to the throne. Bessus was probably connected to the Achaemenid royal family, though his exact relationship to Darius remains unclear in the ancient sources. Livius and the Encyclopaedia Iranica both note that he may have had a credible claim to royal descent, but the precise lineage is not established. What mattered, politically, was that the claim existed and was believable enough to use. You cannot seize the title of King of Kings without some legitimate basis for it. Bessus had enough of one, and he intended to use it. He had governed Bactria, the great eastern satrapy, roughly corresponding to modern northern Afghanistan, with a degree of autonomy that bordered on independence. The Iranologist Richard Foltz described the eastern satrapies as practically Bessus's personal domain, and that description captures the reality accurately. Bactria was prosperous, strategically positioned, and home to some of the finest cavalry in the ancient world, the Bactrian heavy horsemen, nomadic in culture, ferociously effective in battle, loyal to their satrap rather than to any distant king they had never met. Bessus also maintained solid relationships with the Saka and Dahai tribal confederacies further east, nomadic warrior peoples of the Central Asian steppe, who respected strength and territory above all political abstractions. When Bessus called, the East answered. That made him the most powerful single individual still standing on the Persian side of the war, and at Gaugamela he had seen exactly what Darius was worth on a battlefield. It is worth pausing on that. At Gaugamela, Bessus commanded the left wing of the Persian army, directly opposite Alexander himself. He He was not a spectator at that defeat. He was a participant up close, watching his carefully positioned Bactrian cavalry engaged, and then outmaneuvered while Darius's centre crumbled and the king turned his chariot and fled. Bessus had fought hard on that wing. He had seen the battle deteriorate in real time, had understood the tactical failure as it unfolded, and had managed his own withdrawal without being destroyed. He was not running in panic when he followed Darius east. He was retreating with his eyes open, calculating, watching, and measuring. By the time the army reached Ecbatana, Bessus had already formed a view of Darius that he would never revise. The king was finished as a military commander. The king was, in the cold language of political survival, a liability. The second man in this conspiracy was Nabazanes, and his position in the Persian structure made him arguably more dangerous than Bessus. Nabazanes held the title of Chiliarch, an office connected with the royal cavalry and the king's daily affairs, especially access to the royal presence, a role closer to what we would today call a royal chief of staff or vizier. He managed all official audiences with the king. He controlled who entered the royal presence and when. He was, in other words, the human filter through which all information reaching Darius was processed. If you wanted to see the King of Kings, you went through Nabazanes. If you wanted to control what the King of Kings knew, you needed Nabazanes. His power was not the visible, martial power of a battlefield commander. It was the invisible, structural power of a man who stood between a king and his own empire. There was a third co-conspirator, less prominent in the sources but important. Nonetheless, Barcentes, the satrap of Arachosia and Drangiana, the eastern provinces corresponding roughly to parts of modern Afghanistan and Pakistan. Barcentes brought his own regional forces to the conspiracy, extending its geographic reach further east. The central conspirators were Bessus, Nabazanes, and Barcentes, with other eastern nobles such as Satibazans appearing in some ancient accounts. Together they represented something remarkable. Not a random mutiny, but an organised coalition of the Eastern Empire's most powerful men, each with his own forces, his own territory, and his own survival to protect. This was not impulsive violence. This was a planned transfer of power. The plan itself, as recorded by Quintus Curtius Rufus, was presented to Darius before the arrest, and this detail matters because it reveals exactly how cynically sophisticated the conspirators were. Nabazanes called a formal assembly of the army and proposed to Darius's face that command be temporarily transferred to Bessus for the duration of the war against Alexander. The argument was framed with a kind of twisted logic. The army, demoralized by repeated defeats under Darius's command, would fight more effectively under a new leader who had not yet lost to Alexander. Once the Macedonian threat was defeated, so the proposal went, power would be transferred back to the rightful king. Darius would simply step aside temporarily, for his own good, for the empire's survival. It was the oldest political trick in existence, framing a power seizure as a sacrifice, dressing a coup in the language of necessity. Darius's reaction tells us everything about the man. He did not simply refuse. He was reportedly furious, drawing his sword against Nabazanes on the spot, threatening to kill him. For a brief, electrifying moment, it looked as if the King of Kings might meet his conspirators with steel rather than chains. But Nabazanes had prepared for that reaction. He had his own guard close by. Darius, looking around at the faces of the men surrounding him, and the weapons in their hands, sheathed his sword. He was still the king. He still had soldiers loyal to him, Greek mercenaries under Patron, and some Persian units who had not yet transferred their loyalty. He was not completely powerless, not yet. But Bessus and Nabazanes read that moment correctly. They understood that the confrontation had accelerated the timeline. Darius now knew what they were planning. He would try to organize resistance, reach out to the mercenaries, consolidate whatever loyalty remained around his person. Every hour they waited gave him more opportunity to do exactly that. And every hour they waited, Alexander was getting closer. The Macedonian was not sleeping. His intelligence network, built from deserters, scouts, and cooperative locals, was feeding him accurate information about Darius's movements and his army's deteriorating state. Bessus knew that if he moved slowly, he would be trapped between a crumbling political situation in the east and an approaching military steamroller from the west. He had a very narrow window in which to act. There is a chilling rationality to what Bessus was calculating on those long marches east, dust coating his armour, the mountains of the Iranian plateau rising around him. He was not, by his own logic, simply a traitor. He was a realist. The Western Empire was gone. Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, all of it. There was nothing left to save west of the Zagros Mountains, but the east, Bactria, Sogdia, Parthia, the wild territories bordering India and the steppes. The east was a different world, a world that Alexander would have to fight his way through inch by inch, for years, on terrain that suited Bessus's mobile cavalry warfare, and suited it far better than it suited Macedonian phalanxes. With Darius gone, Bessus could proclaim himself King of Kings, rally the eastern peoples around a new, energetic Achaemenid claimant, and make the conquest of the east so costly that Alexander might eventually stop. It was a gamble, but it was a rational gamble, and keeping Darius alive was not part of it. Because there was one version of events that destroyed Bessus's plan completely, and that was Alexander capturing Darius intact and presenting himself to the world as the legitimate protector of the Persian king. Alexander had already made it clear, through his treatment of Darius's captured family at Issus, and afterward, that he intended to present himself not as a conqueror but as a successor. He treated Darius's mother Sisygambis with the respect due to a queen. He paid for the funeral of Darius's wife Statera when she died in his camp. He was building a narrative, and in that narrative, a living rescued Darius was a weapon. A Darius who voluntarily accepted Alexander as his protector would have legitimized Macedonian rule across the entire empire, east included, in a single stroke. Every satrap who was still holding out would have had no choice but to bow. Bessus could not allow that. He could not allow Alexander to find Darius alive and cooperative, which meant that Darius could not be left free to make his own choices. He had to be controlled, he had to be in custody, and then, at the right moment, he had to be removed. The decision was made somewhere in the hills east of the Caspian Gates. The arrest would happen. The King of Kings was about to become a prisoner of his own empire, and the instrument of his humiliation was already being prepared. A covered ox cart, the kind used to transport goods across the royal road. Functional, anonymous, utterly undignified for a man who had once received ambassadors on a throne of gold. The night was coming for Darius, and his own generals were carrying it. Speaking of things being hidden, information, identity, power, the men who conspired against Darius succeeded partly because they controlled what he knew and when he knew it. In today's world, the people who control your data control a piece of your life too. NordVPN encrypts your connection, hides your online activity from anyone watching, and lets you browse as privately as Bessus planned his coup. Except, unlike Bessus, NordVPN actually keeps your secrets. Link is in the description. Now, back to 330 BC, because the arrest is happening tonight. The Persian army east of the Caspian Gates had become a column of ghosts. That is the only honest way to describe it. It moved through the landscape of the Iranian plateau, rocky, dry, a country of harsh ridges and narrow valleys that seemed designed to exhaust men rather than shelter them. And it moved with the joyless, mechanical momentum of men who were no longer sure what they were marching toward. There were still thousands of them. There were still cavalry units from Bactria and Scythia, still infantry contingents from the eastern satrapies, still the Greek mercenaries under Patron marching in their tight professional formation, and still, somewhere near the front of the column, the royal party around Darius himself. But the unity of purpose that turns a collection of armed men into an army had already been broken. Bessus and Nabazanes had made their intentions clear. Darius had drawn a sword and then put it away again. And every man in that column knew that something irreversible had been set in motion. The question was no longer whether it would happen. The question was when. The answer came in the night. According to the account preserved by Quintus Curtius Rufus, who drew on earlier sources now lost to us, Bessus and Nabazanes moved against Darius, while the army was encamped east of the Caspian Gates, somewhere in the region that ancient sources associate with the territory of Parthia, in what is today northeastern Iran. The exact location is not recorded with precision, but the sequence of events is consistent across multiple ancient sources. Arrian's Anabasis, Curtius's History of Alexander, and Diodorus Siculus all confirm the essential shape of what happened. The conspirators moved at night. They came with armed men, their own personal guards, soldiers loyal to their purses and not to any fading throne. Darius's Persian guard, already demoralized and unsure of its own loyalties, did not mount a decisive resistance. Patron's Greek mercenaries were not called. Whether they were not informed in time, whether they were deliberately isolated from the royal party, or whether Darius himself, even now, refused to give the order that would trigger a civil war inside his own shrinking army, the Greeks did not intervene. And so Darius, the King of Kings, Lord of all nations, the chosen of Ahura Mazda, was taken. This is the brutal truth that no sanitized retelling ever lingers on long enough. They laid hands on him, men who had bowed in his presence, men who had received their governorships from his hand, men whose fathers and grandfathers had served the Achaemenid throne. These men put their hands on the king's body and restrained him. There was no ceremonial abdication, no formal legal process, no council of nobles voting on succession. There was darkness, armed men, and physical force applied to a king who could not stop it. Everything that the Persian court had constructed over 2 centuries, the elaborate protocol, the prostration before the royal presence, the divine mystique, the curtained audiences, all of it dissolved in that one act of physical restraint. You can build all the mythology you want around a king, but mythology ends the moment someone grabs your arm and you cannot pull free. And here is where the detail that gives this act its name enters the story. They did not chain him in iron. They chained him in gold. This is not a poetic embellishment invented by later writers. It is reported in the ancient sources, and it carries a very specific, deliberate meaning. Bessus and Nabazanes were making a statement with those golden chains, a statement about their own intentions as much as about Darius's condition. Iron chains are for criminals, for slaves, for prisoners who are simply to be restrained and forgotten. Golden chains are for kings. They were telling the world and telling themselves that this was not the end of the Achaemenid monarchy. This was a transition. Darius was not being destroyed. He was being managed. The golden chains said, "We respect the institution, even as we remove the man. We are not barbarians. We are not rebels against the Persian order. We are the Persian order correcting a mistake." The chains also served a legal and political purpose. Darius was being held not as a criminal, but as a royal captive, someone who might still be useful as a bargaining chip, someone whose death, if it came to that, needed to be handled with enough ceremony to prevent the act from looking like simple murder. The gold was cover. It was the conspirators telling themselves the story they needed to believe. He was placed in a covered ox cart, an enclosed wagon with a canvas or wooden covering that sealed it against view. Under normal circumstances, this kind of cart was used to transport supplies and goods across the royal road network. It was utterly, deliberately undignified. The man who had received foreign ambassadors seated on a throne raised above the floor, who had ridden to battle in a magnificent royal chariot flanked by the royal guard, who had been addressed with formulaic reverence by everyone who entered his presence. That man was now a piece of cargo. He was folded into the dark interior of a supply wagon, and the covering was drawn shut. The outside world continued to move around him, the column marching, the cavalry riding, the dust rising, and Darius watched it through whatever gaps existed in the covering, or did not watch it at all, sitting in the dark with golden chains on his wrists and the sound of his empire walking away from him. The army was ordered to continue marching east. Bessus assumed command. He did not yet formally proclaim himself King of Kings. That declaration would come later, after Darius was gone. But in every practical sense, from the moment the ox cart began to move, Bessus was giving the orders, and Darius was no longer doing anything at all. The transition of power had occurred without a battle, without a formal ceremony, and without any of the legitimizing rituals that Persian culture had always required for a change of reign. It had occurred because one man had more armed guards in the right place at the right time. That is how power actually works when the ceremonies stop meaning anything. What was Darius thinking inside that cart? The ancient sources do not give us direct access to his inner world at this moment. They were not writing psychology, they were writing history. But Curtius, who had a novelist's instinct for dramatic texture, gives us fragments. He describes Darius as a man who had already begun to accept his fate, not in the sense of surrender or cowardice, but in the way that a man accepts fate when he has looked clearly at his situation and understood that the options have run out. He had tried at Gaugamela. He had tried to rebuild at Ecbatana. He had tried to reason with Bessus and Nabazanes. He had refused Patron's mercenary guard for reasons of dignity, and that dignity had cost him his freedom. There is a particular kind of grief in a man who can trace the exact sequence of decisions that brought him to ruin. And who knows that changing any single one of them might have changed everything? Darius had all the time in the world to sit with that grief in the dark interior of a covered wagon rolling east. Meanwhile, those who remained loyal to him, a shrinking group, were in a desperate situation. Some of Darius's personal companions did manage to escape the camp and ride hard. Their destination was Alexander. They were going to tell the Macedonian exactly what had happened. They were going to tell him where Darius was, what condition he was in, and who was responsible. Whether this was genuine loyalty to a beloved king, or a calculated bet that Alexander would reward the informants, probably both, the effect was the same. The fastest riders available were now closing the distance between Alexander and the location of the covered cart. The clock that Bessus had always known was ticking had just been wound much tighter. In the darkness of that wagon, somewhere on a dusty road cutting through the Iranian plateau, the last king of kings of the Persian Empire lay chained in gold. Behind him, 3,000 years of civilization. Ahead of him, the sound of wheels on stone and the uncertain mercy of men who had already decided they did not need him anymore. And from the west, growing louder, came the sound of hooves, Macedonian hooves, moving fast. Alexander did not sleep when he heard what had happened to Darius. The report reached him while he was still west of the Caspian Gates, delivered by Bajstanes, a Babylonian nobleman, and Antibulus, the son of the Persian commander Mazaeus, who had ridden hard from the east specifically to find the Macedonian and tell him what they knew. The message was precise. Darius had been arrested by his own generals. He was being transported east in a covered cart. Bessus was in command, and Bessus was moving as fast as he could. Alexander's reaction to this information was not what a conventional general would have done. A conventional general, having just completed the conquest of Persepolis, having marched his army from the Aegean coast of Greece all the way to the centre of the Persian plateau, a march of thousands of miles over years of brutal campaigning, might have paused, consolidated. Let the political situation in the east resolve itself. Let Bessus and Darius neutralize each other. But Alexander was not a conventional general, and what was happening in that ox cart ahead of him was not simply a political crisis. It was an insult to everything he believed about himself and his conquest. He had fought 4 years of war to defeat the King of Kings in legitimate combat. He had planned his reign of the Persian Empire around the idea of being the rightful successor to the Achaemenid throne. A Darius who surrendered to Alexander or was captured by Alexander was a Darius who legitimized everything. A Darius stabbed in a ditch by his own frightened generals was a Darius who gave Alexander nothing, no ceremony, no submission, no symbolic transfer of authority. And Bessus, declaring himself the new king, was now a rival claimant rather than a conquered subject. Alexander would not allow it. He stripped his pursuit force down to its most mobile elements. He left the infantry behind. They were too slow. He took his companion cavalry, his lightest horsemen, and a corps of his best officers, and he drove them east at a pace that Plutarch describes as almost beyond human endurance. The ancient sources record the distance covered in that pursuit, 3,300 furlongs in 11 days. That is roughly 400 miles. 400 miles in 11 days of continuous movement, through the dry heat of the Iranian plateau, through terrain that offered little water and less shade. Plutarch records that Alexander's own soldiers were collapsing from thirst and heat exhaustion along the route, men dropping out of the column simply because their bodies gave out. Horses were being worked to death and left behind where they fell. When some of his Macedonian soldiers found water in skins on their mules near midday and brought some to Alexander, who was reportedly nearly choked with thirst, he was offered a helmet full, the same way any common soldier would have drunk. He looked at the men around him, all of them just as thirsty, and passed the helmet back untouched. He told them he could not drink when they could not. That gesture, small as it was, tells you something important about why those men were still following him at this pace after 4 years and 4,000 miles. He was not driving them from behind, he was pulling them forward. He reached the village where Darius and his captors had camped the previous day, 1 day behind. He pressed on through the night. At some point on that final stretch, a local man, the sources describe him simply as someone who knew the road, told Alexander there was a shortcut, a route that would cut the distance to where Bessus's column was now moving. It was harder ground, less water, but shorter. Alexander took it immediately, selecting 500 of his fastest riders and leaving even the rest of his cavalry behind. 500 men, just fast horses and the Macedonian king, riding through the dark on a shortcut through foreign desert, hunting the last king of Persia. Inside the ox cart, the situation was deteriorating by the hour. Bessus was receiving his own intelligence, reports that Macedonian cavalry was closing fast, much faster than should have been possible. He had calculated the distance, measured the time he had, and the numbers no longer added up. Alexander was not following at a normal army's pace, he was sprinting. And Bessus, who had gambled everything on having enough distance to reach Bactria and organise his eastern kingdom before Alexander caught up, now understood that the gap was collapsing. He had hours, not days. He went to the cart, he opened it and told Darius to get out. He needed him on a horse. The column had to move faster than oxen could pull a covered wagon. If Darius rode, they could maintain speed. If he stayed in the cart, they were going to be caught on open ground with Alexander's cavalry behind them and nowhere to go. And here, in the final hours of Darius III's life, something remarkable and deeply human happened. He refused. In one powerful ancient tradition, Darius refused to move. The man who had fled from 2 battlefields, who had retreated from Ecbatana rather than fight, who had accepted the golden chains rather than trigger a civil war that he might have survived. This man, at the end, would not move. Whether it was physical weakness from days of confinement, whether it was the decision of a man who had simply stopped running, whether he calculated that if Alexander arrived he was safer as a royal prisoner than as a fugitive, or whether it was something simpler and more human. The refusal of a man to give his captors one more thing, to take one more order, to participate in one more indignity, is something the sources do not resolve. But the refusal was real. Darius stayed in the cart. Bessus made his decision. What happened next is recorded in multiple ancient sources with enough consistency to be trusted in its essential shape. The conspirators, Bessus, Nabazanes, and Barsientes, along with some of their personal guards, attacked Darius inside the cart. They stabbed him multiple times with their javelins. They did not stay to confirm he was dead. They mounted their horses and rode east as fast as they could, abandoning the cart on the road, abandoning the dying king inside it, abandoning whatever plan had once involved golden chains and political transitions and the careful management of a royal prisoner. It was not an execution. It was not even a murder with dignity. It was panic. It was armed men in a hurry, stabbing something that was in their way and riding off into the dust of Bactria. 200 years of Achaemenid history ended not with a final speech or a last stand. It ended with the sound of hooves fading east, and a man alone in the dark of a wooden cart bleeding out onto the floor of the wagon that had once been his prison, and was now his tomb. Almost immediately afterward, Alexander's advance riders found the cart on the road. A near-contemporary Babylonian chronicle confirms the episode around July 330 BC. Greek and Roman sources place the final scene in Parthia, near Chora or Hecatompylus, east of modern Tehran. According to Plutarch's account, one Macedonian soldier named Polystratus reached the cart and found Darius still alive. Barely. He was multiple wounds deep into dying, but he had not yet gone. Polystratus gave him water, cold water, from whatever supply the soldier was carrying, and Darius drank. And then, in Plutarch's telling, Darius spoke. He said that it was the mark of the greatest misfortune that he could not repay the kindness. He asked Polystratus to take his hand, and to tell Alexander that he died grateful. Grateful that Alexander had treated his family with honour, and that he was leaving behind someone to avenge him. Those are his last recorded words. The hand of a dying king placed in the hand of a foreign soldier as the final act of a reign that had once stretched across nearly half the known world. Then Darius III was dead. When Alexander arrived at the cart and looked inside, whether he found a dying man or already a corpse depends on which ancient source you follow, with Plutarch and Diodorus differing on this specific point. What he saw ended the longest pursuit of his military career. He removed his own cloak and placed it over the body of Darius. That gesture was not sentiment. It was politics, and it was principle, and it was both simultaneously. He was declaring in the clearest possible terms that this man was a king and would be treated as one, and that the men who had killed him were murderers and traitors and would be treated as such. He arranged for Darius to receive a full royal burial in the tradition of the Achaemenid kings, with the ceremonies and the honours appropriate to his rank. The body was eventually transported to Persepolis, where Darius was interred among his ancestors. Alexander wept. The ancient sources record this. A man who cried easily, who felt things sharply, who had built an entire campaign around the idea of legitimate succession rather than simple conquest. He stood over the body of the king he had spent 4 years chasing and understood that he had been robbed of the ending he needed. And then he turned his attention to Bessus. The pursuit of Bessus took another year. The Bactrian satrap had proclaimed himself king of kings under the regnal name Artaxerxes V, reaching back to the Achaemenid naming tradition to give himself a veneer of legitimacy that his act of regicide had already destroyed. He fought a guerrilla campaign across Bactria and Sogdia, what is today Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, using exactly the mobile cavalry tactics he had always intended to use, on exactly the difficult ground he had planned to fight on. He caused Alexander real problems. The Bactrian and Sogdian campaigns were the hardest, most grinding fighting of Alexander's career. But in 329 BC, Bessus was betrayed. Not captured in battle, betrayed. His own allies, 2 Bactrian nobles named Spitamenes and Dataphernes, handed him over to Alexander in chains. There is a particular poetic weight to that. The man who had arrested his own king was in turn arrested by his own allies. The instrument of betrayal was turned against the one who had wielded it. Alexander's punishment of Bessus was carefully, deliberately calibrated. He did not simply execute him quickly. He first ordered that Bessus's nose and the tips of his ears be cut off, a punishment drawn directly from Persian royal tradition. The Behistun inscription, carved by Darius the Great himself, describes this exact mutilation being applied to rebels and usurpers. Alexander was not acting as a Macedonian king punishing a military enemy. He was acting as the rightful king of Persia, punishing a regicide, using the tools of Persian law against a Persian criminal. Every detail of the punishment was a message. This is what happens to a man who lays hands on a king of kings. Then Bessus was transported to Ecbatana, the old Median capital where Darius had once tried to rebuild his army, for formal trial before an assembly of Persian nobles. There the sentence was carried out in full. The sources disagree on the exact method. Plutarch gives the famous account of 2 trees forcibly bent together, tied to Bessus at the tops, then released, tearing him apart as the tree straightened. Other traditions describe mutilation, formal judgment, and execution at Ecbatana without specifying that method. Whatever the precise form, Bessus died in agony, in public, in a manner designed to be remembered. And it was. His name survived 2,300 years not as the man who nearly saved the Eastern Persian Empire, not as the capable cavalry commander who fought Alexander to a standstill in Bactria for a year, but simply as the traitor, the man who stabbed his king in a cart and ran. Darius III, last of the Achaemenids, was buried with his ancestors at Persepolis. The 200-year empire he had failed to save outlasted him in memory, in architecture, in culture, in the administrative systems that Alexander and his successors would borrow wholesale to govern the vast territory they had won. The empire did not die with him, but the dynasty did, and the dynasty died not at Gaugamela, not at Issus, not on any of the great set-piece battlefields where Alexander proved his genius. It died on a road in Parthia in July 330 BC, in a covered cart at the hands of the men sworn to protect it. That is the brutal truth. History loves a clean story. It loves the idea that empires fall to conquerors, that great men are defeated by greater men, that the arc of civilizations bends according to the will of the strongest warrior. And Alexander the Great is, without question, one of the most extraordinary military minds who ever lived. He deserved his victory. He earned every mile of it. But the fall of the Persian Empire, the real fall, the final collapse of the Achaemenid dynasty that had governed nearly half the known world for 200 years, did not happen on a battlefield. It happened in a cart. It happened in the dark, on a dusty road in Parthia, between men who could no longer agree on what their loyalty was worth, Alexander did not destroy the Achaemenid dynasty. Bessus did. Nabazanes did. Barcentes did. The empire was not conquered from the outside. It was surrendered from the inside, piece by piece, decision by decision, betrayal by betrayal, until the last king of one of history's greatest civilizations was lying on the floor of a supply wagon, with javelin wounds in his chest, asking a foreign soldier to carry his final words home. That is not a story about military genius. That is a story about what happens to power when it loses the belief of the people holding it up. Darius did not fail because he was a weak man. The record does not support that. He failed because the structure around him failed first. His satraps calculated their odds and chose themselves. His court officials weighed their survival against their loyalty and chose survival. His army, assembled from 40 peoples across a continent, found that when the ceremonial glue of Achaemenid prestige dissolved under Macedonian pressure, there was not enough shared identity underneath to hold the whole thing together. The empire was a magnificent construction, but construction requires maintenance, and the Achaemenids, by the time Darius inherited the throne, had been coasting on the architecture of Cyrus and Darius the Great for generations, without doing the hard, daily, unglamorous work of renewing the loyalty that held it all in place. Alexander understood this. That is why he wept over the body. He did not weep for an enemy. He wept because the story he needed, the rightful transfer of power from one king of kings to the next, the ceremony, the submission, the legitimacy, had been taken from him by frightened men with javelins. He buried Darius like a king because he needed the world to see him as the king's successor, not his executioner's beneficiary. Even in grief, Alexander was thinking clearly. That is why he won. And Bessus, who had planned so carefully, who had read the situation with such cold intelligence, who had the territory and the cavalry and the bloodline and the nerve to actually seize power, Bessus ended with his ears and his nose cut off, tried before the nobles of the empire he thought he was saving, and torn apart in public at Ecbatana. Every man who had watched him arrest Darius in golden chains eventually understood the lesson. Betrayal is a tool, and every tool cuts both ways. The Persian Empire was the greatest political construction the ancient world had ever seen. It did not deserve to end the way it ended. Neither did the man in the cart. That is the story. The betrayal that history forgot to put at the centre of the narrative where it belongs. If this script hit different to anything you have watched recently, if it changed how you see the fall of Persia or Alexander, or what power actually looks like when it collapses, tell me in the comments below. I read every single one. Drop your take on Bessus down there too. Was he a traitor or a realist? That debate is worth having. Like this video if you made it all the way here, because it genuinely helps this channel reach more people who deserve to know this story. Subscribe if you're not already here, because this is exactly what we do. The brutal truth behind the wars that made the world. And check the description for the next video because the story does not end here. It never does.